Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be implementing the code system. The code system involves a GUI where players are able to enter in a code, hit the redeem button, and then receive some rewards. Now, hopping directly into Roblox Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is add in the open button to our left GUI where all of our other buttons are at. And then we'll go ahead and create the GUI itself. Now, of course, before we do any GUI work, what we always want to do is go to the test tab and enable device emulation. And if you've been following along with us this far, then you want to make sure that you're using the HD 1080. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and add in the open button. So inside of the start GUI, we have the left screen GUI, and then we have a frame inside of here. Let's go ahead and duplicate the social button, and then I'll select the button on the top. Now, of course, if you're having any layout issues, what I would recommend that you do is modify the layout order of each of the different text buttons, but ours are looking perfectly fine, so I'm not going to modify that. With that being said, let's go ahead and rename this button to be called Codes. Then inside of here, let's go ahead and update the text label. And for the text of this, instead of saying social, we'll go ahead and say codes as well. Then we'll go ahead and update the image of the icon image label. And for the image, we want to go ahead and use the Twitter icon, which is the little bird that we can see right there. And with that being said, we're now finished with adding in this button. So what that means is we can now begin working on creating the GUI. In order to save us a bunch of time, what we're going to do is duplicate the Rebirth GUI. The reason that we're doing that is because our Codes GUI is going to have a lot of the similar properties and components that we've used in creating the Rebirth GUI. Now that we've duplicated this, let's go ahead and rename this to be called Codes, and then we'll go ahead and set the enabled property to true so that we can actually see it. Then let's go inside of the screen GUI, inside of the frame, and we'll start off by editing the title text label. So for the text of this, instead of saying Rebirth, we of course want to go ahead and say Codes. Then we're done with the title. Let's go ahead and update the description. For the description of this, we're going to go ahead and promote our social media and recommend that players follow us on social media in order to receive some rewards. So I'm going to say follow at MonzterDev on Twitter for awesome rewards. But of course, you can customize this to say whatever you'd like. Next, let's go ahead and update the use button. Rather than displaying Rebirth, we want to go ahead and display Redeem. So we'll go ahead and update the text of the title text label inside of here, and we'll go ahead and make the text say Redeem. Now, we are actually going to get rid of the progress bar canvas group because we are going to replace it with a text box, and it's going to have pretty similar sizing and positioning. So we're going to leave the progress canvas group for right now, but let's go ahead and add in the text box. Now I'm going to rename this text box to be called Code, as this is where the player will enter their code into. And now let's resize and reposition this. So for the position, we're going to go with the same positioning that we already have on the progress bar canvas group. So let's just go ahead and copy the anchor point from here and paste it onto the text box. Then we'll also go ahead and copy the position and paste that into the text box as well. And now we can see that that is positioned nicely. Then for the sizing of this, we're actually going to make this a little bit smaller than the progress bar. So on the x-axis in the offset, let's go ahead and set this to 375. And on the y-axis, we're perfectly fine with leaving that at 50. Now we're almost ready to delete the progress bar, but before we do that, let's actually go ahead and take the UI stroke as well as the UI corner and put that inside of the code text box as well. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and delete the progress bar. Now with the UI corner, we actually want this text box to be as round as possible. So on the scale, we're going to go ahead and set that to 1. Then for the UI stroke, currently, because the apply stroke mode is set to contextual, this is being applied to the text inside of the text box, which is perfectly fine, but we do want to modify this a tiny bit. So before we do that, we're going to go ahead and duplicate the UI stroke. And the UI stroke that we're working on now is the one that we're actually going to use for the text on the inside. So we're going to leave the apply stroke mode to contextual so that it applies to the text inside of the text box, but we want to change the line join mode from round to miter. And then for the thickness, we want to decrease this a little bit. So rather than going with 5, we're going to go ahead and go with 3. Then we'll go to our other UI stroke. And first we want to go ahead and change the apply stroke mode to border so that the stroke appears around the border of the text box. And that's actually all that we have to modify for this UI stroke. So all of these are actually looking perfectly fine. But currently we can clearly see that the text on the inside of this text box is looking pretty odd. And that's because we now have to actually customize the text box. So first, let's start off with modifying some text properties of the text box. Let's go ahead and first set the placeholder text, and the placeholder text is the text which is first displayed to the player. Once the player clicks into the text box, the placeholder text will be removed in order to begin displaying what the player is typing out. So what do we want to be displayed before the player begins typing out a code? Well, we're going to say code and then 3 periods. And then we actually want to modify the text property and set that to blank in order to force the placeholder text to actually be shown. Then let's modify the text color, and we want to set the text color to white. And then we want to adjust the text sizing. And we're going to increase the text size a little bit, so we're going to go from 14 all the way up to 34. Then let's go ahead and modify the font property, because instead of using Source Sans Pro, we of course want to go ahead and use Ferdoka 1. Now we have to modify another color property on this, and that is actually the placeholder color. And we want to modify this from a gray to actually being a white. Now, if you click inside of your text box, you can see that part of the text box begins to blink, and this is where we can actually type our text in at. So we could go ahead and say test to actually see what the typed out text actually looks like. And I think that is looking pretty good. So once we click back into the text box, we can see that previous text was removed, and now it displays the placeholder text once again. And with all that being said, we're now fully finished with creating this GUI. So let's go ahead and set the enable property of this GUI to false so that we no longer see it. And then we can also collapse the starter GUI because we're done working inside of there. Now that we've created the GUI, we can begin scripting this. So in order to begin scripting this, we're going to go ahead and create the codes config. Inside of the codes config, we'll create a couple of different functions that will be used by both the server and the client side, as well as writing out the actual codes which are able to be redeemed. So in order to create the config, where are we going to go? Well, of course, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and then we'll go ahead and create a brand new module script inside of here. Let's go ahead and rename this module script to be called codes, and then we'll go ahead and rename the module variable to be called shared. We'll update the return statement, and then above our shared variable, we'll go ahead and create our local variable like we always do. Now, actually, before both those variables, we want to go ahead and create a brand new type. And this type may be used by other scripts, so we're going to first start off by using the keyword export. Then we'll say type, and now the name of the type that we want to create is going to be called code object. And we're going to set this equal to a table. Now this table is going to have a couple of properties. The first property is going to be code, which is going to be a string, and that's going to be the actual code which is able to be typed in and redeemed. We'll then go ahead and use a comma. And the second property that we're going to include is the expiration property, which is going to be a number. Now, the expiration is going to be a Unix timestamp, which we've talked about before, but Unix timestamps are essentially dates and times converted into a number that most computers and we can use while scripting in order to work with specific dates and times and things like that. Then for the third and final property, this is going to be called reward, and the type of this is actually going to be another table. And inside of this table, we're going to have one property, which is going to be called type, and this is the type of reward that we want to give to players. Now, because our obby is very simple, the only reward that we're actually ever going to reward players for using codes is going to be skips. So whenever a player redeems a code, they're going to be rewarded with skips. But the reason that we're actually adding a reward and the specific type here is because I'm trying to make this as dynamic as possible in order to allow you to maybe add some custom rewards that you might want to give to your players. Maybe you add in a shop system to your obby or different things like that, and you want to easily be able to reward different amounts of currencies or things like that to your players as well. So with this setup, you'll easily be able to do that. Now, type isn't the only property that we're going to include inside of here. The other property that we want to include is going to be called amount, which is going to be a number, and that'll allow us to specify the amount of skips or the amount of another reward that you would want to reward the player with when they redeem the code. And with that being said, we're finished with creating that type. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is create the actual config and specify some codes along with their expiration time and what reward we want to give for redeeming that specific code. So we're going to go ahead and create a local variable, which is going to be called config. The reason that we're creating this as a local variable and not just as a shared or a part of the local table is because we need to be able to specify the type of this. And because of how variables work inside of tables, you're unable to actually specify the type of that. So that's why we have to create it as a local variable first. Anyways, to specify the type of this, what we're going to do is say that this is going to be a table of code objects. Then we'll go ahead and say equals and set that to a brand new table. Now, inside of this table, we're going to store multiple tables. And of course, as you probably already realized, inside of this table, we're going to have multiple other tables, and each of those tables are going to be a code object. Now, before we begin creating a couple of different code objects, I'd recommend that you go down below in the description to this Unix timestamp website, because this website is extremely easy for generating different Unix timestamps that you may be looking for. Now, this timestamp right here is the current time in a Unix timestamp. And I'm actually going to go ahead and copy that. Basically, I want to create two different codes. One code which is already expired so that we can make sure that we see what happens when we redeem an expired code. And then we'll have another code which will expire at a later date because that'll allow us to test actually redeeming a code and receiving some rewards for it. And once we've redeemed the valid code, we can then try to redeem it again to also see what happens when we try to redeem a code which has already been redeemed. So because I'm recording this on the 19th, where it says enter date and time, all of this information is filled in with the current date and time. So what I'm going to do is just set this to a couple of days in advance, click convert, and then I'm going to use this timestamp as well as one of the current timestamps that this website is constantly updating with as well. So that'll give us an expired and an unexpired code. So going back to Studio, let's go ahead and create our first code. First, we want to create a brand new table. Then we want to go ahead and specify the code property, which is going to be a string. I'm going to go ahead and call this code expired. Then I'll add a comma, and then I'll specify the expiration time. Now, actually, technically, I can literally just set the expiration time to 0 because that's what the timestamps began at all the way back in, I think, 1970 or whenever these timestamps actually began. So we know that 0 is already expired. We don't actually have to use the expired one that I was talking about before, but you can do it either way you want. It really doesn't matter. Anyways, now that we specify the expiration time, let's go ahead and specify the reward as well. And for the reward, we of course are going to reward some skips, and the amount of skips that we're going to reward is 0 because this is just a test code and we know that we're not actually going to be able to even redeem this code, so the reward doesn't actually matter. Now that we've created our first code object, let's go ahead and insert a comma there, and then we'll go ahead and create our second code object. For the second code object, we're going to specify the code as valid. Then for the expiration, we're going to set that to a timestamp which has not expired yet so that we're able to test redeeming an actual valid code. And then for the reward, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new table. Of course, we'll go ahead and reward some skips. And how many skips do we want to reward? Well, let's just go ahead and reward 99. And now we've created our second code object. If you want to add more codes, all you have to do is add a comma here and then create some more code objects like we've just done already. But with that being said, we're finished with creating this config, so let's go ahead and actually share this config variable so that it can be accessed by other scripts which require this module script. To do that, we'll of course add the table to the shared table, so we'll say shared.config equals config. And now that we're sharing the config, let's go ahead and create some functions. And all the functions that we're creating are going to be a part of the shared table. So we'll go ahead and say function shared dot. And the first function that we're going to create is going to be called getCode. Now this function is going to be used for getting code objects. So technically you should probably call this getCode object if you want to avoid confusing yourself. And this function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the specific code, aka a string that the player is trying to redeem. And we can also specify the return type of this function as well, which is going to be a code object, but we can't guarantee that the code object is actually returned. So let's go ahead and use a question mark to specify that it could also be nil. Now that we've created that function, in order to get a code object from the given code, what we need to do is iterate through all of the code objects inside of our config. So we'll go ahead and say for underscore comma code object in config do. Now, as we're iterating through each of the code objects, we want to go ahead and check if the code of that object is the same as the code given to this function. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called isSameCode. And now what we'll do is check if the code of the code object, so we'll say code object.code equals the specific code that's been given to this function. And now if it is the same code, so we'll say if same code then, what we're going to do is go ahead and return the code object. Now, there's one more thing that we can do to this function to make it a little bit nicer, but when I say nicer, it definitely comes to personal preference. Currently, our codes are case sensitive. So what this means is that if we have a code valid, for example, the player will need to type this with the capital V and then all lowercase the rest of the letters. But if we would like our codes case insensitive, then that would allow players to type out the word valid in all lowercase letters, for example, even though our code specifies that the first letter needs to be capitalized. And at least my preference is to make our codes case insensitive so that just in case the player types the code out incorrectly, meaning that they either forgot to capitalize or lowercase a specific letter, I still want the player to be able to redeem the code because I don't care if they forgot a capitalization or lowercasing a letter, for example. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is on both of the codes, we're going to use the specific method called lower. And what lower does is it actually turns the entire string given to it into all lowercase letters. So then when we use lower for the other code, that'll make both of the codes all lowercase, which will now make our codes case insensitive. So players don't have to worry about specifically capitalizing or lowercasing all of those letters. As long as they spell it right, include all of the characters and things like that, they should be perfectly fine. Now that we've created that function, we're going to create a couple of other functions. And these functions are going to be used in order to determine if the code can actually be redeemed or not. So the first function that we're going to create, again, is going to be a part of the shared table, and it's going to be called isExpired. And this function is going to accept the code object. So we'll go ahead and say code object. Now, I usually like to call all of my code related stuff the word code. So even code objects or the actual string of the code, which that definitely may cause confusion. So if you want to be a little bit more responsible than me, I would recommend that you use the word code object anytime that you're actually working with a code object instead of using the word code. But I kind of just really like the word code, so that's why I'm going to kind of do that. Anyways, in order to determine if a code is expired or not, what we're going to do is return, and what we're going to return is os.time, which gives us the current time as a Unix timestamp, and we're going to check if the current time is greater than when the code is expiring. So we'll go ahead and say code.expiration. So if the current time is greater than the expiration time, then we know that the code is expired. Then below that function, we'll go ahead and create another function, which again is going to be part of the shared table, and we're going to call this is redeemed. And again, this is going to accept a code object. And this is also going to have a second parameter though, which is actually going to be the player's data. Now, because this module script is actually going to be used by the player data's module script, we're unable to specify the type of the player's data, but that's okay because we're really not doing anything too invasive in the player's data, and it's really simple. Now, I know that we haven't actually updated the player's data yet, but again, what we're doing is very simple. So in order to determine if a player has redeemed a specific code or not, what we're going to do is use the keyword return. Then we're going to look inside of the player's data because we're going to create a table called codes. And inside of the table is where we're going to include all of the different codes that the player is able to redeem. And if the code has been redeemed or not, the value of that code is going to be set to true. So all we have to do is index this table with the specific code of the code object, and that'll let us know if the code has been redeemed or not. Then we'll go ahead and create one final function inside of here, which is going to be called Is Redeemable. This is going to have two parameters once again. The first is going to be a code, which is of the code object type. And now the code object here is actually optional, so we're going to go ahead and include a question mark there. And the second parameter is going to be the player's data once again. Now, this function is going to be used by both the server and the client side. There's one difference between the server and the client side and how it's going to be used. On the client side, we're actually going to use this function, of course, in order to determine if the player is able to redeem the code or not. But in addition to that, we're also going to use this function in order to display sort of an error message to the player if their code is not able to be redeemed because it's expired or it's already been redeemed or different things like that. So this function is going to return different strings, which those strings are going to be sort of the error message which we're going to be displaying to the player whenever they try to redeem a code and they're unable to. So the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is we want to check if a code has actually even been given to us. So we're going to say if not code, and if a code has not been given to us, we're going to go ahead and say return code invalid. Then we want to go ahead and check if the code is expired. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called is expired. And how are we going to check if it's expired? Well, all we have to do is use that function that we created earlier. So the isExpired function and pass through the code object. Now, if the code is expired, then we want to go ahead and return a string, which says code expired. Then after that, we want to go ahead and check if the code has already been redeemed. So we'll create a variable called isRedeemed, and we'll go ahead and use the isRedeemed function to check this. Of course, we need to pass through the code as well as the player's data. And now, if the code is already redeemed, then what do we want to do? Well, we're going to go ahead and return code already redeemed. Now, if we make it this far into the function, then we know that the player is actually able to redeem the code. So what we're going to return is actually true. And that's all we have to do to determine if the code can be redeemed by that player. So with all that being said, we're now finished with creating the code's config, so we can go ahead and exit out of this script. Now, the next thing that we want to do is actually update the player's data so that we're able to store all of the codes inside of the player's data and then update them whenever the player has redeemed a brand new code. So in order to update the player's data, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage and open up the player data module script. Towards the top of here, we want to go ahead and require the codes config that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say codes, and then we'll go ahead and rename the variable to be codes config. Then we first want to update the player data type. So after skips, we're going to go ahead and add in codes, which is going to be a table. And for the keys of this table, they are going to be strings, which is going to be the individual codes. And then for the value of each of the codes, it's going to be a boolean. So true or false based on if the player has redeemed the code or not. Now that we've updated the type, we need to do something similar to what we do with the settings config. And we need to basically iterate through all of the codes in order to add that to the player's data. So above where we do that with the settings data, let's go ahead and create a variable for the codes data, which is going to be equal to a blank table. Then we want to iterate through all of the code objects. So we're going to say for underscore comma code object in codes config .config do. Then we're going to go ahead and use the codes data variable and index that table with the specific code. So we'll say code object .code, and by default, the player has not redeemed any codes. So let's go ahead and set this to false. So now that'll iterate through all of the codes inside of the codes config and effectively set the codes data to include all of those codes with the value of each of those codes being false in order to specify the default player data and say that none of the codes have actually been redeemed because, of course, by default, none of them have been. Now that we've created that variable, let's go ahead and actually update the player's data. So we want to go ahead and update the default player data variable. And inside of this table, after skips, we want to go ahead and add codes to this. And for the value of codes, we're going to set that to the codes data. And now that we've done that, we've officially updated the player's data with all of the codes in our game. So now we can start modifying the player's data whenever they actually redeem a code. And with that being said, we're finished with updating the player's data, so we can go ahead and close out of that script. Now that we've updated the player's data, another thing that we usually have to update after modifying the player's data is actually the state manager. So to do that, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the functions folder, and open up the update state module script. And now, inside of here, what we're going to do is add in a brand new action. So, of course, we want to go ahead and update the update state action type. Then, after the rebirth action, which actually I kind of messed this up a little bit, but now of course I have to adjust the formatting. Okay, there we go. So after the rebirth action, we're going to go ahead and add in a brand new action. And now for the type of this action, we're simply going to go ahead and call it redeem code. And now this action is going to have a second property, which is going to be the actual code that the player has redeemed. So the type of that is going to be a string. And that's actually all that we have to do for this specific action. So I'm going to go ahead and fix the formatting just like that. And now we have our brand new action. Since we've created a brand new action, let's go ahead and actually implement this into our function. So after the else if statement for use skips, we're going to go ahead and create another else if statement. This time, if the action.type equals redeem code, then what do we want to do whenever a player redeems a code? Well, we're going to go inside of the player's data, we want to go inside of their codes table, and then we want to index that with the specific code which is given to us from that action. And now what do we want to do? Well, of course, we want to update the value of this and we want to set it to true. So of course, this action is going to be used from the server side every single time the player has redeemed a brand new code. And if it wasn't obvious enough already, we need to do this to prevent the player from redeeming the same code multiple times. Now, with that being said, we're finished with updating how the player's state is actually managed, so we can go ahead and close out of this module script. Now, we're almost ready to begin scripting this on the server side, but before we do that, we need to add in a brand new remote event in order to communicate from the client side when the player wants to redeem a specific code. So inside the replicated storage, inside the remotes folder, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new remote event, which I'm just going to duplicate one of the ones that we had previously because it's quicker than adding it in. But now we want to go ahead and rename this brand new remote event to be called redeem code. And like I said, this remote event is going to be used by the client side to communicate to the server, hey, we want to redeem this specific code, let me redeem it. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and collapse the remotes folder, and we can actually collapse the replicated storage as a whole because we're finished with inside of there. Now that we've done all of that, we can begin scripting this on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and to make this a little bit easier, we can go ahead and duplicate the rebirth service. Of course, we're going to go ahead and rename this to be called the code service though. Then we can go ahead and open up that module script, and inside of here, we do need the replicated storage, we do need the player data service, but we don't need the respawn service or the stages config. But instead of deleting this variable, let's go ahead and update this because we are actually going to need the codes config. So we'll go ahead and say codes, and then we'll go ahead and say codes right there as well. And then we'll also need the remotes variable as well and the onStart function. But of course, we're not going to use this remote event. I know we're kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves now, but I'm hoping that you guys have kind of seen how our scripting works and kind of recognize the different patterns that we've been using. So because we've created a brand new remote event, which is called redeem code, we're of course going to use that remote event here and listen for that remote event to be fired by all of the clients. And then whenever that remote event is actually fired off, we're going to connect that to a specific function, which we're of course going to create inside of here. So we can go ahead and update the onStart function right there to use the redeem code remote event for right now. But then we can go ahead and delete the rebirth function and create our new function, which is going to be part of the local table. And this is going to be called redeem code. Now, the first parameter is going to be the player who is trying to redeem a code. And the second is going to be a string, which is the actual code that the player is trying to redeem. And since we've created that function, let's go ahead and finish off connecting this to the remote event. So this, of course, is the function that we want to connect the remote event to. So we'll go ahead and connect it just like that. Now, I guess I should actually specify that the string or the code is optional because we cannot guarantee that the client passed to us an actual code. Realistically, that'll only happen if somebody is an exploiter, but we do want to account for that because an exploiter could lag our game by causing a ton of errors on the server side and really mess things up. So let's go ahead and account for that. If no code has actually been given to us, then let's go ahead and stop the function right there. Now that we know that we've at least gotten a code given to us, let's go ahead and get the player state. So we'll create a variable called state, and we'll go ahead and get the player state using the player data service. .get state, then we'll go ahead and pass through the player. Now, if we do not get the player state, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to stop the function right there. After that, let's go ahead and get the code object from the specific code. So we're going to create a variable called code object, and to get the code object from the code, we're going to use the codes config, and we'll use the get code object function, and then pass through the code. And now, if we don't get any code object, then we want to go ahead and stop the function right there because we know the code is not a valid code. And now we want to check if the code is actually redeemable. So we'll create a variable called is redeemable, and to determine if the code is redeemable or not, we're going to use the codes config. So we'll say codes_config.isRedeemable. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the code object as well as the player's state. So we'll go ahead and say state. And now the isRedeemable function returns multiple strings or a boolean, which is true. So we can't just say if is redeemable then, because like I said, is redeemable returns multiple strings, and if we get any of those strings, then we know that the code is actually not redeemable. And when you say if and then just the variable, this is basically asking if is redeemable is anything except for false or nil. So what we instead need to do is check if is redeemable does not equal true. Because if it does not equal true, then we know that the code is actually not redeemable. And if it is not redeemable, then once again, we're going to go ahead and say return n to stop the function right there because, well, the code is not redeemable. But now, once we've made it this far down, we know that the code is actually redeemable. So let's go ahead and redeem the code as well as reward the player. So first, we'll create a variable for the actual reward. To get the reward, we need to use the code object and then use the reward property. Now, because like I said, we were trying to make this reward system pretty dynamic, so what we're going to do is check the type of the reward, and if the type of the reward is skips, then we're going to handle that a specific way. But now, of course, if you have different reward types, you can create multiple else if statements here in order to specify the logic for what needs to happen when you're trying to reward that specific reward. So since we're rewarding skips, we're going to create a variable called skips action, which is going to be of the player data service.update state action type. And now for the type of this, we're going to use earn skip. Then we want to specify the amount of skips that the player has earned, which is actually going to be of the reward.amount variable. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and use that action. So we'll go ahead and say player data service.update state. Then we'll pass through the player as well as the skip action. Then after that and outside of that if statement, what we now want to do is create the action for redeeming the code. So we're going to create a variable called code action and then specify the type of this to be the update state action type. Now, for the type of this action, it's going to be called redeem code, and we need to specify the code property, which is the actual code that the player is trying to redeem, which is going to be of the code object.code type. And the reason that we're using this code instead of, say, this code, which is the code given to us from the player, is because I just never like to trust the user input that's given to us from the client. Even if the code is redeemable and everything like that, you just never know. So it's always safer to rely on your own data, which you can guarantee has not been manipulated by anybody else. And that's why I'm preferring to go with the code from the code object here, even though it should be perfectly fine to go with the code which is passed to us from the player. Anyways, now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and update the player state. So we'll say player data service.update state. We'll pass through the player, and then we'll also pass through the code action as well. And there we go. That's all we have to do on the server side to know if the player is able to redeem a code or not, and then actually give them the rewards and redeem the code. And we already have this function hooked up with the redeem code remote event. So anytime a client tries to redeem a code, this function will be called, and then it will run through all this logic right here. So with that being said, we're now ready to start implementing the logic on the client side. So let's go ahead and close out of the script. We can go ahead and collapse the server script service, and we'll go inside of the start player, inside of the start player scripts, inside of the controllers folder. And the first thing that we want to do is actually update the GUI controller because we want to add in our brand new codes GUI to here. So we'll go ahead and open up the GUI controller. Then we'll scroll down to the GUI's variable, and then we'll go ahead and copy and paste this line. Or if you want to type it out all yourself, you certainly can do that. But the GUI that we want to wait for is called codes. And for the key here, instead of saying rebirth, we're going to go ahead and call that codes as well. Now that's all we have to do to update the GUI controller. So we can go ahead and exit out of that. And now we're going to go ahead and create the script, which includes all of the logic for redeeming a code. So inside of the GUI's folder, we're going to go ahead and duplicate the rebirth module script. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called codes and then open it up. Now, inside of here, we do need the replicated storage as well as the sounds config, but we don't need the stages config. Instead, what we want to do is create a variable for the codes config. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then I also, just to kind of keep these things alphabetically ordered, I'm going to move this codes config above sounds config, but that organization really doesn't matter that much. Anyways, we still are going to need the GUI controller as well as the state controller and the remotes variable. Then let's go ahead and update our GUI variable. So instead of using the rebirth GUI, we of course want to use the codes GUI. Then we still want to get its frame, but we don't have any progress bar inside of here, so we're actually going to use the code text box. So let's go ahead and rename this variable from being called progress bar to being called text box. And of course we set that to the text box, which is called code. Then we have our use bun, which we actually called the redeem bun, but we still had it named use, so we can just kind of keep it the same here, calling it use, for example. But then for the open bun variable, instead of setting that to the rebirth bun, we of course want to set that to the codes bun. Then looking at the onStart function, we of course want to set up the GUI, passing through the GUI and the open bun. We're not going to call update progress though, because we're not even going to have that function inside of here. Then for the use button, the logic here is going to work pretty similar. Instead of calling the rebirth function though, we're going to go ahead and call the redeem code function, which I know that we haven't created yet, but go ahead and just update that right here because that is the function that we're just about to create in a minute. When it comes to using update state inside of here, we are going to still use this because whenever the code is redeemed, we want to listen for that redeem code action to be used, but we can modify this a little bit. For instance, we don't need the new state, so we can actually delete that, but that doesn't really matter. You can leave it if you want to. It's not like unused parameters matter at all. And then inside of here, we can just go ahead and clear all this out because we're not going to use any of that logic. And then we'll go ahead and come back to this after we've written some other logic. Then going down to these functions, we're actually just going to go ahead and delete all of those functions because we don't need them. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead and start creating some brand new functions. Well, actually only a single function because that's all that's actually required here. Anyway, let's go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be part of the local table. And this function is going to be called redeem code. And it's actually not going to have a single parameter. Now, remember, we're already calling this function inside of the onStart function. So this function is going to be called every single time the use button is actually clicked on. So anytime the redeem or use button is actually clicked on, we want to go ahead and try to redeem the code. Now, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is get the actual code. So we're going to create a variable called code, and to get the actual code, what we're going to do is use the text property of the text box. Because when the player types out whatever they type out in a text box, that text is actually set in the text property of the text box. Now, if we don't actually get any code, then we want to stop the function right there. And now that we've saved the code that the player typed out in our code variable, let's go ahead and actually reset the text of the text box. So we're going to say textbox.text equals blank, and that'll clear out whatever the player typed in the text box. Then let's go ahead and create a variable for the code object because we now want to get the code object from the specific code that the player typed out. And of course, how do we get the code object? Well, we use the code's config, and then we use the getCodeObject function passing through the code. Now that we've gotten the code object, we want to go ahead and check if the code is redeemable. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called Is Redeemable. And to determine if the code is redeemable or not, of course, we'll use the code config, and then we'll use the Is Redeemable function passing through the code object and the player's data. So to get the player's data, we need to use stateController.getState, just like that. Now remember, the Is Redeemable function returns a couple of different strings as well as true if the code is redeemable. So if the code is not redeemable, we would say if is redeemable does not equal true, then what do we want to do? Well, we would want to notify that the player is not able to redeem the code. And because the isRedeemable function returns a couple of different strings, we're able to be very specific and really notify the player why they were unable to redeem that code. So to do that, what we're going to do is update the placeholder text of the text box, and we're actually going to set that to the string that's returned from isRedeemable. So now if the code is expired or if the code has already been redeemed by that player, that will now actually be displayed to the player. And then to make another visual improvement to this, what we're going to do is actually change the color of the placeholder text. So we're going to modify the placeholder color 3 property. And what do we want to set that to? Well, we would set it to a color 3.fromRGB. And I'm going to change the text to be a red. So we're going to go ahead and set that to 255, 0, 0. And then since we also implemented our sound system, we can use the sounds config to play a specific sound. And the sound that we want to play is called error. So now we're sort of notifying the player in multiple ways as to the code not being redeemable and why it's not redeemable as well. So if the code is not redeemable, then we want to actually stop the function right here after we've performed all of that logic. So we'll go ahead and say return to stop the function right there. But now after that if statement, if that if statement is never actually ran, then we know that the code is redeemable. So in order to redeem the code, we need to fire off the redeem code remote event over to the server side for the server to perform the logic for redeeming the code. So we'll go ahead and say remotes.redeemCode fire server, and then we want to pass through the code that the player is trying to redeem. And now that's actually all that we have to do with this function. So scrolling back up a little bit, we can see that we have already connected this function to when the use button is clicked, so we don't even have to do that. But now remember how if the code is not redeemable, we modify the placeholder text as well as the placeholder text color? Well, what we want to do inside of the onStart function is actually revert that change. Now, to make our lives even easier, what we're going to do is create two constant functions. So the first constant function is going to be called original_placeholder_text. And this will actually be the original placeholder text before we modify it. So to get the original placeholder text, all we would have to do is get the actual placeholder text property of the text box. Then we'll create a second variable, which is going to be called original_placeholder_color. And really, you might want to call this text color, but I'm fine with just calling it color, because now what we want to do is actually get the placeholder color of the text box before we change it. And now that we've created those two constants, let's go back down to our onStart function. And actually, I'll add in this logic before the state controller. It really doesn't matter. It literally just comes down to personal preference. But now, in order to reset the placeholder text to what it was before we modified it, what we're going to do is listen to an event on the text box, which is called focus lost. And this is actually fired whenever the client lets their focus leave the text box. And this generally happens when the player is not typing in the text box, or they might have clicked something else outside of the text box. That's sort of how it's able to lose focus. Anyways, we'll go ahead and connect this to an anonymous function, which actually we don't need either of these parameters, so we can go ahead and remove them. Anyway, when the focus has been lost on the text box, what we want to do is revert it to its original color and its original text. So we'll go ahead and say textbox.placeholderText equals original placeholder text, and then we'll go ahead and also say textbox.placeholderColor3 equals original placeholder color as well. And now the placeholder text as well as the placeholder color will be reverted to what it was originally whenever the focus has been lost on the text box. Now the last thing that we have to do is actually add in some logic inside of the update state event for whenever a code has successfully been redeemed. Now we can know when a code has been redeemed based on the type of the action. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called isRedeemAction. And to determine if the action is the redeem action or not, we would use the type of the action and we would check if the type is actually redeem code. So now if it is a redeem action, then what we want to do is notify the player that the code has actually been redeemed. And to do this, we're again going to update the placeholder text, sort of how we visually display to the player that their code is not able to be redeemed. So we're going to go ahead and say textbox.placeholderText equals, and now if a code is redeemed, we'll go ahead and say code redeemed. Then we'll go ahead and update the placeholder color 3 as well. And this time I want to go ahead and use a green color. So I'm going to say 0, 255, which will give us a nice bright green, and then 0 once again, so that we get that nice bright green color. In addition to that though, we also want to use the sounds config in order to play a specific sound whenever a code has been redeemed. And the code that we're going to go ahead and play is called confirm. And now with all that being said, we've fully finished implementing all the logic on both the server and the client side. So we can go ahead and close out of this module script and then start up our game in order to test this out. Okay, so now that we're in our game, we'll go ahead and open up the code's GUI. We can see that it does actually open up and that's all working perfectly. Let's click the redeem button. When we click the redeem button without any code entered, we can see code invalid. Then let's go ahead and click into the box and now begin typing out our code. So let's go ahead and start typing out our first code, which the first code was expired, and we can actually use this code to test what it looks like when a code has been expired. So we'll click redeem, and then we can see that code expired has been displayed to us. Now let's also test the case sensitivity. So I'm going to go ahead and type out expired in all lowercase letters and try to redeem that, and we can see that we're getting the same error message, which is code expired. And keep in mind, code expired is different than code invalid, for example, as if the code was not actually even valid at all. But then we also have our valid code, which starts with a capital V, but again, just to test the case insensitivity, we'll go ahead and type it in all lowercase letters and then go ahead and click redeem. Once we've done that, we can see that the code has been redeemed. And even in our output, we can see that our data has been updated as well. Then let's go ahead and check how many skips we have. And well, now we have a ton of more skips. So I guess technically we should have checked this beforehand, but I can guarantee that this is actually working. And if you're doing your own test, then you should also be able to confirm that as well. But one more thing that we can do is actually test out the valid code again and see if we can redeem it 2 times. So let's try to redeem it again. And when we try to redeem it again, we can see that we were given the error code already redeemed. So this is all working exactly as it should. Now, one thing that I actually forgot about while recording this video is Roblox's policy service. Basically, Roblox has a policy service which we can actually use, similar to, say, the player service or the server script service or any of the other services that we're able to use. And the policy service helps us build gameplay components that can be made compliant with various national regulations for multiple countries. And you might be wondering, well, how does the policy service have anything to do with what we worked on today? Well, pretty much the policy service has one major method, which is called get policy info for player async, and that'll return the policy information about a specific player. Now, when we use that method, what is returned from that method is a dictionary, and we can see all the things that are inside of this dictionary right here. So we can use this to determine if ads are allowed for the player, if paid random items are restricted, if the player is eligible to purchase a subscription, and the one that applies to us is allowed external link references. So if we refer to external links, which would include services like Discord, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and X, then that means that we would want to use the policy service to make sure that the player is actually allowed to even know about these external links. Otherwise, our game can get taken down and we could get in trouble. So going back to Studio, there's 2 different places that we need to apply the policy service in this specific context. The first one is for the icon that we use for the open button. Now, in my opinion, all this icon actually is a blue bird, but if we're being honest, I'm not entirely sure if Roblox would agree with us, so it's definitely smarter to be on the safer side rather than determining that Roblox actually doesn't agree with us and now our account is banned and our game has been deleted off of their platform. Then the second place that we need to implement the policy service is actually for the description inside of our code's GUI, where we recommend players follow us on Twitter for awesome rewards. Luckily for us though, implementing this is extremely simple and easy, and it really doesn't take much work to do at all. So what we're going to want to do is go back to the GUI script that we just created. So inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, inside of the GUIs folder, we have the code's module script. Inside of here, towards the very top of the script, we're going to want to go ahead and get 2 more services. The first service that we're going to want to get is the player service, and the next service that we're going to want to get is the policy service. Then all the way down towards the very bottom, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new local function, which is going to be called handle policy service. and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, because of how we have our GUI set up, by default, the icon that's being used is the Twitter logo, and the description is also recommending players follow us on Twitter. But of course, by using the policy service, if the player is not allowed to see them, then we of course want to change them. So what we're going to do inside of this function is go ahead and create a variable for storing the original icon and the original description that we're using. So we're first going to create a variable called original icon. And to get the original icon, we're going to go inside of the open button. Then we'll go inside of the icon, and then we'll go ahead and use the image string from that icon. Then we want to create a variable for the original description as well. So we'll go ahead and say original description. And to get the original description, we're going to go inside of the frame, inside of the description text label, and grab that text. So now that we've saved the original description and the original icon, let's go ahead and change the icon and the text just in case the player is not allowed to see these things. Of course, if the player is allowed to see these things, then we'll revert these changes, but we would much rather be on the safer side, and in case any errors occur later in this function alone, we make sure that no matter what, we're not allowing the players to see things that they should not be allowed to see. Now, taking a look at all the images that we have in our game, the specific icon that I'm going to use is actually the rename icon, which is just a pencil. Maybe you can find a better one in here that you might prefer to use, or one of your own icons might be better to use in this scenario as well. But either way, I'm going to go ahead and copy the asset ID. Then what I'm going to do is actually change the icon. So I'm going to go ahead and say openbutton.icon.image and then set it to this string right there. Then we'll go ahead and update the description. So we'll say .text, and for the description, I'm actually just going to recommend players join our Roblox group, which we're allowed to do. So I'm going to say join our group MonzterDev for awesome rewards. And now the next thing that we want to do is actually use the policy service. Now, when we use the policy service, we actually have to wrap that inside of a P call just in case that fails. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable, which is kind of creating two variables. So we'll first say success, and then we'll say result equals P call. Then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And then we'll go ahead and return the result of using the policy service. So we'll say policy service, and then we want to use a method of the policy service, which is get policy info for player async. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the specific player, so players.localPlayer. Now, if for some reason we were unable to get the policy info for the player, we're going to say if not success, then, and we'll simply go ahead and print out that there was an error. So we'll say print policy service error, and then we'll print out the result along with that message. And we'll also say return here as well to stop the function right there. But now after this, if we were able to get some policy information about the player, what we then want to do is create a variable called allowed links, because what we now want to do is go inside of that result, which was returned to us from the get policy info for player async method, because inside of the result, there is another table inside of there called allowed external link references. Now make sure that you spell all of this exactly the same way as I do. Now, like I said, this is going to be a table. And inside of this table is where they're going to list all of the services as strings, which the player is allowed to have access to. So things like Twitch, Discord, Facebook, Twitter, and other things like that. So then we'll go ahead and create a variable called is Twitter allowed. And to determine if Twitter's allowed, because what allowed links is it's actually an array and not a dictionary, we have to use the table.find function. And we want to, of course, look inside of the allowed links table. And the specific link that we want to check if the player is allowed to see is called X. Now, keep in mind that I always call Twitter, Twitter, and I will always call Twitter, Twitter till the day I die. I'm not going to call Twitter X. I'm sorry, but I just cannot get behind that change at all. Maybe I'm just becoming an old person at this point and all the kids are okay with calling it X, but I will never call Twitter X. Unfortunately for us, though, it seems like Roblox was very quick to update their API, and instead of returning Twitter, it now only returns X. And also make sure that you capitalize the letter X here, otherwise you will not actually find that inside of the allowed links as well. Then we're going to go ahead and use an if statement, because if Twitter is allowed, then what we're going to do is revert the open button icon and the description to what it originally was. So we'll go ahead and say openbutton.icon.image equals original icon, and then we'll also revert the description as well. So we'll say frame.description.text equals original description, and there we go. We've now created this entire function. So let's go ahead and use it. And where are we going to use it at? Well, we're just going to go ahead and use it at the very beginning of the onStart function. And the only reason that we're doing this is just in case there's any other errors along the way. If any of these things error out inside of this function, wherever the error occurs at, everything below it will not actually be ran. And because of how important it is for this to actually run, we want to make sure that if anything breaks, it breaks after we call this function. So let's go ahead and call it right here, and we'll go ahead and say handle policy service just like that. And now we can actually test this out. And Roblox actually provides us a pretty easy way of testing this out. We can go to the test tab, And inside of the test tab under emulation, there's two sections. So far, we've used the device section, but there's also a player section as well. Now, when we click the player section, you should see the window pop up. If it pops up as a side window, what I would recommend that you do is actually drag this out because you really need to expand it. If it's too small, you literally will not see the open button there. And I'm not sure why I feel like Roblox kind of should have, made this dynamically sized or prevent the window from becoming too small. But yeah, it's Roblox Studio. It's a very small indie company. Anyway, what we're going to do is enable the test profile. And then once we've enabled the test profile, this basically gives us a lot of options for different things that we can use with the policy service. Really, the only one that we actually care about is the allowed external link references. And right here, we can toggle on specific links that we want to allow. So right now, I have X disabled. Let's go into our game and see what it looks like as a player who is not allowed to see Twitter links. So as a player who's not allowed to see Twitter links, we see that the code's icon now becomes a pencil. And if we look at the description, it recommends for us to join the group. So we can see that that is actually working as it should. Now let's go ahead and allow X links, then start up the game. And now once we get into our game, we can see the original bird icons there, and we can see the original description is there, recommending that players follow us on Twitter as well. So we can see that our implementation of using the policy system is working exactly as it should be. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below, letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit MonzterDev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.